Horror, truck carrying bodies. Without organs to Vietnam, vertical bar, autonomous region of Mexico. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Have you ever wondered how much darkness can hide behind the bright lights of a city? Tonight's story takes us deep into a case where polished glass towers concealed one of the most chilling networks imaginable. It's not just a tale of crime, it's a reminder of how fragile safety can feel when evil hides in plain sight. Stay with me as we uncover the path that led investigators from stormy border raids to the very heart of the city, where a shadow known only as the Consul may still walk among us. And before we begin, if you find meaning in stories like this, if you want to walk with me through more journeys of truth, resilience, and mystery, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let us begin. The rain had been falling steadily over Otay Mesa that November night, a cold drizzle drifting inland from the Pacific and spreading a dull silver sheen across the pavement. At the border crossing, the air felt heavier than usual, the kind of night where even the hum of an idling truck seemed too loud. Deputies from the San Diego Sheriff's Department had been running routine inspections when one refrigerated semi caught their attention. The vehicle was old, its white paint dulled with grime, its engine throbbing in a way that suggested something concealed, something off. The driver, a stocky man in his 40s later identified as Miguel Mikey Ortiz, gripped the steering wheel as if it were a lifeline, eyes fixed forward, refusing to meet the gaze of the officers. Detective Grace McKenna, a veteran of the department with 2 decades in major crimes, approached the truck with her flashlight cutting a beam through the mist. Even before the steel latches were touched, she caught the first trace of an odor seeping through the chilled doors. It was faint but unmistakable, a thick, sweet-sour stench that clung to the back of the throat. Grace had smelled death before. The recognition hit her like a memory she wished she could bury. With a quiet command, she ordered the doors opened. 2 deputies wrestled with the latches until they gave way with a metallic groan. A burst of cold air surged outward, biting against their faces, carrying with it a stench so powerful one of the younger officers gagged and stumbled back, clutching his sleeve to his nose. Inside, the beam of the flashlight cut across a row of black plastic bags, thick and glossy, stacked neatly along the floor in 2 tight rows. Each was the size of a curled human form, condensation beading on the surface, rivulets of moisture sliding down like sweat. From one seam, a yellowish liquid leaked slowly onto the floor, where it mingled with the rain dripping in from the open door, forming a sickly puddle. For a long moment no one moved. The only sound was the steady drizzle striking the roof of the trailer and the low mechanical hum of the refrigeration unit. Grace's jaw tightened. She radioed for the county medical examiner. Dr. Samuel Cho arrived minutes later, calm but alert, his hands already tugging on latex gloves. He crouched by the nearest bag, tracing its seam as the team watched in uneasy silence. At Grace's nod, he produced a sharp blade and pressed it into the thick plastic. The sound of it tearing open sliced through the night, sharp and intimate, and as the bag sagged wide, the cold air rushed out with the smell of something that should have been hidden forever. Inside was a body, or rather the remains of one. The skin was waxy and pale, the limbs stiff, and where the chest should have held the weight of organs, there was only an emptiness crudely sewn shut with black thread, the stitches jagged and uneven. It was not clumsy work of panic, but a sign of something systematic, methodical, like a butcher working to quota. One deputy staggered back with his hand over his mouth. Another muttered a prayer, the sound breaking the heavy silence. Rain dripped off Grace's jacket as she stared down at the pale form, her mind racing faster than her pulse. This was no accident, no lone crime of desperation. What lay before them was organized, calculated, and deadly efficient. And as her eyes drifted to the long row of identical bags stacked deeper into the truck, she knew with a sinking certainty that what they had just uncovered was only the beginning. Now, Under the floodlights hastily erected beside the inspection bay, the wet asphalt gleamed like a mirror, stretching the shadows of deputies and investigators into long, restless shapes. Rain continued to fall in a steady mist, dripping off brims and jackets, soaking collars, and pooling at their boots as the team prepared to go deeper into the truck. Dr. Samuel Cho adjusted his gloves, his expression controlled, while Grace McKenna kept her stance firm beside him, her jaw set as she braced for what more they might find. Samuel's blade opened the second bag with a practiced hand, the sound of tearing plastic sharp against the muffled rain. Inside lay a pair of legs severed cleanly at the hips. The cuts were exact, smooth lines that spoke of a steady hand and a sharpened instrument. One foot still bore the remains of chipped red nail polish, dulled but unmistakably human, and the sight struck several deputies in silence. One of them murmured about his daughter before falling quiet again, his words swallowed by the hum of the refrigeration unit. Tyler Grant crouched low, camera in hand, the flash popping harsh bursts that froze the scene in fragments of light pale flesh, stiff joints, the plastic shining with condensation. His lens caught something more, a small laminated tag tucked against the seam. Grace reached in, sliding it free with gloved fingers. Block letters and numbers stamped in black. CN L17. She met the eyes of Agent Mark Ellison, who had just arrived from HSI, and saw immediate recognition. "This was not random," he whispered. "This was inventory." They pressed on. Another bag gave way to a head, eyes frozen open in a glassy stare, hair stiff with frost. Another revealed arms, hands curled tight, fingernails painted with a faint gloss that glimmered against the light. None of the bags contained whole bodies. Each was a fragment, a piece of something that had once been someone, and each carried a tag, variations of letters and numbers that grew more sinister the longer the line stretched. It was not the aftermath of violence, but the stockroom of an industry. Grace's stomach clenched, yet she forced herself to keep her voice steady, instructing the team to photograph and number every single bag before anything else. The rain tapped harder on the metal roof of the trailer, each drop a reminder of time slipping by. Samuel straightened, wiping his gloves against his gown, his voice low but resolute. "These are not from one victim. We are looking at many. Whoever did this had the training to remove organs with speed and purpose." His words hung in the damp air, heavier than the rain. Grace let her gaze travel over the long row of bags still waiting to be opened, each one a question they didn't want answered, each one proof of something too organized to dismiss as chance. Behind her, the deputies shifted uncomfortably, their boots scuffing against the wet ground, but no one spoke further. Even Ortiz, sitting cuffed in the patrol car with his head bent low, seemed to shiver each time the sound of tearing plastic reached his ears, as though he knew all too well what was inside. Grace glanced once more at the laminated tag in her hand. CNEL 17. The numbers weren't random. They were a code, a ledger, perhaps a link to something beyond this truck. She turned to Ellison, her voice quiet but certain. "If there are records, then there is a network. And if there is a network, then this isn't just cargo, it's commerce." The thought sent a chill through her far colder than the November rain. What lay stacked inside the truck was not merely evidence of crime, but evidence of an economy that reduced human beings to pieces, barcoded and bagged for shipment. As the rain struck louder on the plastic coverings and the refrigeration unit hummed on, the realization settled over the team like a shadow. They were not standing in front of bodies waiting to be identified. They were standing in the middle of someone's inventory. Inside the stark interrogation room, Miguel Ortiz sat slumped over the steel table, his wrists shackled to the anchor ring. His clothes were still damp from the rain, clinging to his shoulders, and his forehead shone with a thin film of sweat. He stared at the floor as if it could swallow him whole. Across from him, Detective Grace McKenna set down a thick folder with deliberate weight, the sound startling him. She folded her arms, her eyes fixed on him, while Agent Mark Ellison of HSI leaned silently against the wall, his presence filling the corners of the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and unforgiving. Grace began in her measured tone, the voice of someone who had coaxed truths from liars 100 times before. "Miguel Ortiz, 43, independent hauler out of Chula Vista. You picked up a refrigerated load on the Sonora side, that correct? Ortiz shifted, his lips moving before the words came. They told me it was frozen goods. Just food. I didn't look. I didn't ask. They paid cash. His answer was flat, rehearsed, the kind of excuse that disintegrated the moment it was spoken. Grace slid a single photograph across the table, face down. When she flipped it toward him, the image caught him like a blow, a severed leg, pale and stiff, the chipped red polish still clinging to its nails. Ortiz's eyes flicked to it, then away, his jaw tightening as his breath grew shallow. "I didn't know," he muttered, voice cracking. "I swear I didn't." Ellison stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. "Frozen goods don't come with stitches, Miguel. They don't leak through seams. You know what was in that truck." Ortiz swallowed, his throat working hard. For a long moment he sat frozen, then whispered, "They told me never to open the doors. Keep it cold, drop it off, leave fast. That's all." Grace leaned closer, her voice firmer. "Who are they?" Ortiz shook his head violently, eyes darting to the corners of the room as if something unseen watched from the shadows. "I don't know names. They meet me outside altar, always different men. They hand me keys, fake manifests. I drive." Grace's hand pressed a cell phone onto the table. The cracked screen glowed with a line of text messages: "Fresh cargo, deep freeze, deliver before dawn." Another: "No leaks, no mistakes." Ortiz's breath hitched the moment he saw it. "This is your phone," Grace said evenly. "Your prints, your account. Who sent these?" His lips trembled, his shoulders hunched as though he could shrink from the question. "Just codes," he whispered. "Not L.A. I don't know what they mean." Ellison glanced at Grace, the same codes echoing the laminated tags pulled from the trailer. He pressed on, his voice suddenly softer, almost coaxing. "Miguel, men like you are disposable to them. One mistake and you're gone. But if you help us, maybe you live to see daylight. If you don't—" His words faded, the silence heavy enough to fill the gap. Ortiz's eyes darted to the phone, to the photograph, to the unforgiving light above. He shook his head again, then dropped it into his hands, as though bracing against a storm. His voice was barely a breath when he finally spoke. They call him El Consul." The name slipped into the room like a shadow. Ortiz clamped his mouth shut immediately, as if even speaking it had broken a vow. Grace and Ellison exchanged a look, sharp and wordless. The rain outside drummed against the glass, steady and relentless, while inside the air had gone still. One name had cracked the silence wide open, and with it came the weight of something far larger than the man sitting shackled to the table. The cracked phone lay under the harsh interrogation light, its glass reflecting the tense faces in the room. Tyler Grant had been in the digital lab for hours, and now he returned with both the device and a stack of printed images. He spread them across the table, each sheet adding weight to the silence. The first printout was a series of hidden text logs. Grace McKenna read them aloud, her voice flat. "Shipment, CNEL 17, frozen. Transfer before dawn, no leaks. Confirm arrival at Heilbos Point." The words echoed against the walls. Miguel Ortiz kept his head bowed, his shackled hands twitching. Ellison slid the next photo forward. Grainy but clear enough. A corrugated metal warehouse somewhere in the desert, floodlights cutting across sand. In one frame, a forklift lifted a black plastic bag onto a steel pallet. In another, men in jackets stood beside crates stenciled with letters CN and EL. The images left little room for doubt. Ortiz's eyes flicked up for a second before darting back to the floor, his face pale as paper. Grace leaned closer, pressing the photos into his line of sight. "This is Sonora. That's your pickup. You were there." Ortiz shifted, sweat beading at his temple. He muttered, barely audible. "They said don't ask. Just keep it cold. Drop it at the docks." His voice died in the still air. Tyler placed another printout on the table. It was closer, sharper. A white plastic tag, laminated, tied to the zipper of a bag. The letters, CNEL 17, stamped in black, pressed against pale skin and a line of surgical stitching. Grace's breath caught, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Ellison's face hardened. "They're tracking every bag," he said. "Every load is cataloged. This isn't chaos, it's inventory." Ortiz let out a shuddering exhale, his voice cracking as he spoke for the first time with something like desperation. You don't understand. If I talk, I'm gone. They reach everywhere, even here." He clamped his mouth shut again, his whole frame trembling. Grace studied him in silence, then gathered the photographs into a tight stack. Her voice was steady but urgent. "We've got a location. That warehouse is in Sonora. If they're moving shipments by dawn, we don't have time." Ellison nodded grimly. "We go there. Now, before the next load disappears." The rain outside hammered harder against the station windows, as if marking the countdown already in motion. Inside, no one spoke further. The evidence lay spread across the table, and in the quiet that followed, the sense was clear. They finally had a direction. A warehouse in the desert. A code that was no longer just numbers on a tag, but the trail to something vast, and if they hesitated, it would vanish like smoke in the storm. The port of Long Beach never slept. Even past midnight, the glow of floodlights washed the towers of containers in pale gold. Cranes groaned like giants, and the rumble of trucks echoed across the harbor. Jimmy Park had worked these docks for more than a decade, long enough to know the rhythm of freight. But this night, the rhythm broke. A refrigerated truck rolled in long after cut-off hours, its movements cautious, guided by two men in dark jackets who steered it toward a shadowed corner near Terminal Island. New customs stop, new paperwork, new questions. Jimmy crouched behind a stack of pallets, phone clutched in his hand. Through the shaky lens, he caught a forklift rumbling out, hoisting something long and slick onto a steel pallet. The plastic reflected light like wet stone, the shape too human to mistake. Another load followed, then another, all stacked into a container stamped in block letters. CNL-17. The men worked in silence, their speed precise, their motions practiced. In minutes, the container was sealed, a fresh lock snapping shut. It was buried among hundreds of others, indistinguishable except for the code Jimmy had frozen in his frame. One of the men turned suddenly, scanning the shadows. Jimmy ducked, heart hammering, phone pressed to his chest. He stayed still until the truck's engine faded into the night, leaving only the thrum of cranes and the hiss of the sea. At dawn, Jimmy sat in a cafe near the harbor, the footage replaying in his trembling hands. He thought of men who asked the wrong questions on the docks and how quickly they disappeared. But when the morning news replayed images of the Otay Mesa truck, the black bags lined in rows, he knew he couldn't bury it. After pacing outside for an hour, he finally dialed the sheriff's department tip line. His voice shook as he asked for Detective Grace McKenna. That evening, in the back room of the same cafe, Grace and Agent Mark Ellison watched the video on Jimmy's phone. The glow lit their faces as the forklift raised the sealed cargo, the container code bold and undeniable. Neither spoke until the recording ended. Grace exhaled slowly. Same code, same operation. Ellison replayed the moment the lock snapped shut. He tapped the screen. This isn't Sonora anymore. It's here, in Long Beach. Next step isn't storage. It's shipment. Grace felt the truth sink in. The bags were no longer just hidden in trucks or desert warehouses. They were moving through the nation's busiest port, blending with legal cargo, vanishing across the Pacific. Her jaw tightened. We need to know which vessel it's booked on. If that container leaves these docks, we lose it forever. Ellison nodded grimly. Then we have hours, not days. End. Outside the cafe window, the harbor lights burned steady against the night, ships looming like dark mountains at anchor. Somewhere among the thousands of containers waiting for departure sat one sealed with CNEL-17, its contents recorded in silence by a man too scared to speak loudly. And unless they moved fast, it would vanish into the sea with the tide. The Tijuana River Valley lay dark and slick under the November rain, its narrow service roads twisting between reeds and mudflats. From a ridge above, Tyler Grant knelt with his drone console, the faint red light blinking against the storm clouds as the small craft hovered over a clearing below. On the tablet in his hands, the feed streamed back in sharp detail. Grace McKenna and Agent Mark Ellison crouched beside him, hoods drawn tight against the drizzle. In the hollow beneath, two trucks idled near a corrugated warehouse, headlights angled deliberately away from the road. Men in slickers moved with practiced speed, their flashlights sweeping the mud. Tyler lowered the drone, its camera catching the sequence clearly. One truck back to the dock, its container unlatched. A second truck rolled in, plates smeared with mud to blur the numbers. Within minutes, forklifts shifted the sealed cargo from one chassis to the other. By the time the second truck pulled away, the first was already abandoned, its driver climbing into a sedan and vanishing. The trail was gone, new truck, new plates, same load. Grace's jaw clenched as she whispered, "They're laundering the cargo. No paper trail, no link to the original pickup." Ellison's voice was tight. "It's professional. Every load scrubbed before it hits the port." Tyler shifted the drone, focusing on the warehouse door. A man in a rain slicker stood there, clipboard in hand, checking off each container before waving the forklift forward. The drone's lens caught a patch sewn onto his sleeve. Even blurred by rain, the logo was unmistakable. Northwatch Protective. Grace's stomach tightened. A licensed private security firm, standing guard over a ghost transfer in the middle of nowhere. For a long moment none of them spoke, the patter of rain filling the silence. Ortiz's trembling words echoed in Grace's memory. They reach everywhere, even here. He hadn't exaggerated. This was no gang of smugglers in the dark. This was a system shielded by contracts, uniforms, and the legitimacy of corporate names. The rain thickened, streaking across the drone's lens until Tyler pulled it back, climbing altitude before guiding it home. He exhaled slowly as the console flickered to static. "We've got them on record," he said, closing the feed. Ellison straightened, mud clinging to his boots as he looked down into the valley. "By morning that truck will be buried in Long Beach, waiting to sail." Grace pulled her hood tighter, her voice steady but cold. "Then we go after the network, not just the shipment. They can swap drivers all night, but they can't swap the fact Northwatch is in on it." The valley below slipped back into silence as the last engine faded into the storm. Water pooled in the reeds, flowing west toward the ocean, carrying with it the reminder of how quickly things disappeared when no one watched. But tonight they had watched, and the camera had caught every second. Proof now existed that the chain was not just criminal but institutional. And that proof meant the rules of the hunt had changed. The Sonoran desert lay silent, broken only by the faint glow of floodlights strung across the basin. From a ridge 2 miles out, Grace McKenna and Agent Mark Ellison studied the scene through binoculars, their breath misting in the November cold. Below them rose a complex that should not have existed in the middle of sand and scrub. Rows of warehouses walled with steel fencing, coiled in razor wire, and guarded like a fortress. Armed men walked in pairs along the perimeter, rifles slung, their movements steady and practiced. At every corner, cameras panned with mechanical precision, the glass eyes sweeping the dark. The intelligence from Ortiz and the drone had led them here, to what locals whispered about as the Zona Blanca. It wasn't on maps, bore no road signs, and yet it pulsed with the infrastructure of an industrial park. Generators hummed, casting white light over a convoy of refrigerated trailers lined at the loading docks. Trucks came and went without hesitation, each stop logged by men in Northwatch uniforms. Not cartel tattoos, not street enforcers, licensed private security and company gear, guarding an operation that pretended to be legitimate. Through the lenses, Grace caught sight of pallets being rolled out on forklifts. Each one was sealed, crates stenciled with block codes, CN, EL, sequences like ledger entries. Some were driven straight into trailers, others into yawning bays cooled by industrial refrigeration. The scene carried no chaos, no haste. It was logistics, procedure, a supply chain perfected. Ellison muttered, "This isn't a cartel outpost. This is infrastructure." The disbelief in his tone was edged with anger. Tyler Grant crouched beside them with his camera, captured frame after frame, the click of the shutter nearly drowned by the wind. "They've built an entire distribution hub," he whispered. A convoy of 3 trucks rolled through the gate, headlights dimmed. Guards scanned the drivers with handheld devices, checked seals, logged weights. Grace watched the rhythm of it, the discipline, the repetition, and felt her throat tighten. This wasn't men sneaking contraband under cover of darkness. It was a process indistinguishable from any legal port of entry, except for what was being moved. She lowered the binoculars, bile rising in her stomach. Somewhere behind those walls was the truth they had only glimpsed in fragments. The cold rooms, the tags, the inventory that reduced lives to shipments. Ortiz's terror, Jimmy Park's footage, the drone's capture of the container swap, all of it led here. This wasn't a branch, this was the artery. Grace turned to Ellison. We can't hit it now, not with just the three of us. They'd clear it before we broke the fence. Ellison's jaw set hard, eyes locked on the glow below. Then we put someone inside. Proof isn't enough, we need the links. Names. Buyers. As they pulled back into the desert night, Grace glanced one last time over her shoulder. The floodlit warehouses gleamed like a wound in the sand, guarded and relentless. Forklifts moved in silent rhythm, guards patrolled their routes, cameras swept the dark. It was not smuggling anymore, it was infrastructure, hardened and concealed in plain sight. And if they were right, this place was the heart of the network. Alex Torres sat hunched on the edge of a metal chair in the safe house, his hands clenched so tightly that the tendons stood out white against his skin. He had been hiding for weeks near Nogales, too afraid to return across the border, too afraid to speak. Only when Grace McKenna assured him that no one could reach him here did his voice finally break through the silence. He was 26, a construction worker in Sonora, hauling bricks and cement under the desert sun. One afternoon, a man approached him on a job site with an offer easy money for a night's work, just loading cargo. Alex hesitated, then accepted. That evening, a van arrived. Men shoved him inside, a cloth pressed over his face, and then only darkness. When he woke, he was in a concrete room, barely lit by a single bulb. Around him were more than 20 others, mostly young men, some women, all silent. The steel door clanged shut from outside. Each evening it opened again, a guard with a clipboard reading off names. Those called stood up without protest, and the door closed behind them. They never returned. The silence inside grew heavier each night. No one spoke much. They sat on the floor, waiting, eyes fixed on the cracks in the walls, as if answers might seep through. One night, Alex was taken from the room, marched down a corridor chilled by unseen machines. At the end, the door opened. He glimpsed a room of stainless steel, a body on a table, men in masks working with clinical focus. Cold instruments gleamed under white light. Before he could process what he saw, the door slammed, and he was shoved back. His voice faltered as he told Grace how he pressed his palms over his ears afterward, trying to block out the sound's metallic clatter, the faint whine of machinery, but the echoes carried anyway. Each morning, the room where he had slept was emptier. Escape came by accident. A fight broke out one night when guards tried to pull two men from the group. In the chaos, Alex slipped into a side corridor, ducked behind equipment, and found a service door unlatched. He ran barefoot into the scrub, stumbling until he reached a highway where a trucker took him north. He never looked back. Now, in the safety of the safe house, he bent over the table, tears brimming, but his words sharp. They don't hide it. They don't act like criminals. They act like it's business. Uniforms, schedules, order. They'll keep doing it until someone makes them stop. Grace felt the weight of his words settle over the room. Mark Ellison leaned forward, his voice steady but low. Alex, your story, it's what we've been missing. They can deny codes, deny photos, but they can't erase you. Alex lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders trembling. Speaking had drained him, but it had also placed the burden into other hands at last. Grace let her hand rest near his on the table, her voice soft. You survived. Now let's make sure no one else has to go through what you did. The raid came just before dawn. In a patch of scrubland outside Hermosillo, a convoy of unmarked SUVs rolled to a halt, engines cut. Special response officers moved silently through the brush, rifles raised, their boots sinking into damp sand as they surrounded a squat warehouse that looked deserted from the road. Grace McKenna crouched behind a ridge, radio pressed to her ear, knowing that weeks of chasing fragments had led to this moment. The breach was swift. A battering ram split the side door. Beams of light swept the gloom, and within seconds men were forced to the ground, weapons skidding across the floor. Grace stepped inside, the air sharp with oil and refrigeration. Forklifts stood idle near stacks of crates, clipboards scattered on metal desks, shipping forms half filled in both English and Spanish. At the far end, cornered by a loading bay, stood the man they had come for, Luis Herrera, mid-40s, stocky, his North Watch jacket smeared with grime. He didn't resist. He raised his hands and let the agents push him to his knees, face blank. But when Ellison later spread photographs across the table, images from Jimmy Park's video, Tyler's drone footage, and Ortiz's recovered phone, Herrera's mask slipped. His eyes flickered, sweat tracing down his temple despite the chill. At first he claimed ignorance. He was just a supervisor, managing schedules, keeping the floor moving. But as the hours passed and the pile of evidence grew heavier, his voice faltered. He admitted that not every crate was the same. Some carried frozen goods, others held sealed bags, cataloged by codes he never questioned. Once or twice, though, he had seen inside, organs vacuum-packed, QR, labeled the scans opening foreign language files with details, blood type, preservation temperature, shipment notes. His hands shook as he described the chain. No cargo moved straight from Sonora to port. Everything first passed through a riverside junction south of Tijuana, known among the men as El Muelle Viejo, the old pier. There, containers were switched, drivers replaced, plates changed, before the cargo continued north. It was, he admitted, the only fixed point between the desert warehouses and the Pacific routes. When pressed about leadership, Herrera shook his head. He had never met anyone higher than regional coordinators. Orders came encrypted, passed through intermediaries. But once, just once, he had heard a voice on a call. Slow, deliberate, never a name spoken. Afterward the guards had whispered about him, El Consul. By the end, Herrera's composure was gone. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, dragging deep as if smoke might steady him. Fear clung to him even in custody, even with armed men at the door. "You don't understand," he rasped. "This isn't just one place. This warehouse, this pier, they're just nodes in the chain. Shut down one and another will take over. And if I talk too much, they'll find my family before you find them." Grace held his gaze, her voice firm but low. "Then help us cut through the chain. Give us the links." Ari. The information he had given the old pier, the container switches, the QR-labeled cargo, was already enough to push the investigation further than it had ever gone. For the first time, they had more than fragments. They had a route, a transit point, and with it came a chance to strike before another container disappeared onto the tide. The storm broke over the Sonoran desert just as the task force moved. In the gray hour before dawn, a joint convoy of federal police, U.S., liaison officers, and military units closed in on the warehouse complex that had stood untouchable for months. Grace McKenna crouched in the back of an armored vehicle, rain streaking across the windows, her pulse matching the clipped rhythm of radio commands. One word came through the static: execute. Breaching charges lit the gates, steel snapping inward as teams poured through. Gunfire rattled briefly against the storm before dying under the weight of numbers. In minutes, the outer perimeter fell, armed guards thrown face down in the mud, weapons kicked away. Floodlights cut through the rain, painting the compound in harsh white as squads swept each building. Grace and Mark Ellison entered one of the main warehouses with rifles raised. The first thing they found wasn't crates but people, 12 captives shackled to steel frames, their bodies gaunt, lips cracked, eyes wide with disbelief at the sudden burst of light and uniforms. Medics surged in, blankets and IV bags in hand, cutting restraints as whispers turned to sobs. One young woman caught Grace's sleeve with trembling fingers and breathed, "Don't let them take me back." Deeper inside, the scale of the operation revealed itself. Industrial freezers lined the walls, humming in steady rhythm. Ellison tore one open, his light flashing over shelves filled with vacuum-sealed packs, not food, organs. Hearts, kidneys, livers, each one wrapped in sterile film, each tagged with laminated QR codes. A quick scan by a technician revealed blood types, storage requirements, even destination notations in English and Mandarin. On a steel table lay a ledger as thick as a phone book, pages smudged with fingerprints. Grace flipped through it, each line a transaction, dates, codes, initials, and ports marked with chilling precision. Beside each entry was a description no one could mistake: human beings reduced to lists of tissue and blood groups. Her throat tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "Document everything. Nothing leaves here unrecorded." Other teams reported in overcoms. A refrigerated bay filled with sealed cargo units, indistinguishable except for their coded tags. A surgical room still reeking of antiseptic, instruments laid out as if waiting for another shift. Hard drives seized, manifests bundled, evidence boxes filling faster than the trucks that carried them out. Outside, sirens screamed against the rain as rescued captives were lifted into ambulances. Grace stepped into the downpour just as an older man reached from a stretcher, his grip weak but insistent. "Stop them," he whispered, eyes hollow. She squeezed his hand before he was carried away, her chest heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. Ellison appeared from the warehouse, water streaming off his jacket, a sodden ledger under his arm. "This isn't rumor anymore," he said, voice flat. "It's mapped. Routes, buyers, shipments already moving." Grace followed his gaze back toward the glowing hangar, where agents still carried evidence into the storm. The rain beat down harder, as if the desert itself was trying to wash away the stain. For the first time, they weren't chasing shadows or fragments. They had survivors, records, and proof on a scale no one could dismiss. Yet as Grace stared at the final pages of the ledger, the ink smeared but legible, she saw listings marked with dates already passed. Containers already on the water, evidence that what they had seized tonight was not an end but only a beginning. The storm raged on as the compound was sealed, floodlights reflecting off wet steel and the glint of evidence bags. Grace pulled her hood tight and whispered to herself, not as a vow but as a grim truth. The fight has just begun. The rain had passed by the time the families began to arrive. Days after the raid, the evidence compound outside Tucson had become a place of mourning disguised as procedure. Chain-link fences separated the hangars from the parking lot where cars sat idling, headlights glowing as though their drivers lacked the strength to switch them off. Grace McKenna stood near the gate, her badge tucked away, watching as men and women walked through with the hollow eyes of those who had waited too long for answers. Inside, the air was sharp with disinfectant. Rows of metal tables lined the hangar, each bearing a sealed evidence bag or a small box labeled with numbers instead of names. Officials spoke softly, explaining, translating, guiding, shaking hands through paperwork. No voices rose above a murmur. Grief had its own gravity here. Grace saw a woman clutch a bag to her chest, rocking as if cradling a child. An older man collapsed to his knees before a shoebox-sized container, pressing his forehead against it as he whispered words no one else could hear. Nearby, a mother signed documents in silence while balancing a baby on her hip. The infant's sudden laughter sliced through the air, bright and oblivious, and the sound made the room itself shudder. Ellison stood beside Grace, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the floor. Tyler had lowered his camera, unable to raise a lens to what unfolded in front of them. None of them spoke. There were no words to soften what was being handed back. The procession went on for hours. Families entered with questions, some with the faintest thread of hope. They left with bags, with boxes, with silence. Officials called it closure, but Grace knew better. This wasn't closure. It was the beginning of a grief that would not end, a grief that would spread outward to every dinner table, every empty chair, every photograph left on a nightstand. When the last family had gone, the hangar was cavernous, its tables bare. Grace lowered herself into a folding chair, exhaustion pressing down harder than any battle. "We saved 12, she whispered. "But how many more are already gone?" Ellison's voice came quiet beside her. "Too many. Outside, the desert sky had cleared, stars sharp above the horizon. But inside the compound, the air was still heavy, with what had been returned that day, not lives, not even bodies, just fragments of proof that the system had consumed them. Grace stepped out into the night, the hangar doors closing behind her with a hollow echo. Ahead of her stretched the investigation still unfinished, a promise unspoken to every grieving face she had seen. This was not the end. The headlines came first. By the following week, every major outlet from Phoenix to Washington carried the same banner. International Organ Trafficking Network exposed in Sonora raid. Television anchors spoke in grave tones while animated maps traced glowing arrows across borders, from desert warehouses to U.S. ports and beyond. The story became a storm, saturating the airwaves. Officials lined up behind podiums. The Mexican Interior Ministry praised Allied cooperation, U.S. Spokespeople pointed to cross-border intelligence as proof of success. Charts were displayed, numbers recited, promises made. "This operation demonstrates our resolve," one official declared. Cameras flashed, applause followed. On the surface, it looked like triumph. Grace McKenna watched one such broadcast from the corner of a cramped task force office, arms folded, expression fixed. She knew what wasn't being said. Herrera's ledger had listed containers already gone, shipments already sailing. The speeches rang hollow, victory claimed while the chain itself remained unbroken. Then came the leaks. A memo surfaced, suggesting several suspects had slipped away in the days before the raid, disappearing with uncanny timing. Some reports called it coincidence. Others asked harsher questions. Had there been a warning? Had the network reached into the very agencies meant to destroy it? Ellison dropped a folder onto Grace's desk, his face drawn. Inside were reports from internal audits, records of encrypted calls bouncing off towers disturbingly close to a federal outpost. "Somebody's feeding them," he said flatly. Grace scanned the pages, her jaw tightening with every line. The evidence was fragmentary, but the pattern was clear. Their enemy had eyes inside the system. Publicly, the press conferences continued. Smiles for cameras, stern vows of justice. Privately, the task force scrambled. Tyler worked late nights over his monitors, parsing digital traces, trying to separate authentic signals from deliberate misdirection. Every lead seemed to split in two, one pointing forward, the other collapsing into smoke. Grace found herself replaying Alex Torres' words. They don't need to hide. They have order. That order, she now understood, was sustained not just by fear but by protection, contracts, uniforms, and perhaps corrupted hands in high places. The raid had saved lives and seized evidence, yes. But as Grace looked at the faces on the news conferences, politicians claiming credit, officials dodging questions, she felt the weight of what lingered behind the curtain. The network was alive, containers still in motion, and somewhere in the shadows, the figure Herrera had named only as El Consul was watching, adjusting, waiting. For the public, the Sonora raid was a conclusion. For Grace and Ellison, it was something else entirely. A reminder that the mask had only slipped, revealing just enough to prove the machinery beneath was still turning. The task force office was quiet, long after the headlines faded. Fluorescent lights hummed over stacks of files, evidence bags, and half-empty coffee cups. Grace McKenna sat at her desk, thumbing through Herrera's ledger again, the pages still faint with the smell of damp paper. Each entry was a code, a port, a date, stretching back months, maybe years. The raid had stopped one warehouse on one night. The rest of the chain still stretched out like a shadow with no end. Across the room, a young investigator stood before a corkboard crowded with photographs and maps. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence it carried. "That night at Otay Mesa, we stopped one truck. How many others slipped through?" No one answered. Grace looked up, meeting his eyes, but words failed her. She had asked herself the same question every day since the raid. Ellison closed a folder with a sharp snap. "We don't have that number," he said flatly, "and maybe we never will." He gestured toward the map pinned to the wall, dotted with red and black pins. The red marked confirmed seizures. The black marked suspected routes. The black outnumbered the red 3-1. The young man's voice trembled as he pressed on. "If one truck carried what we saw, then what about the ones we missed? How many lives were inside those containers? Where are they now?" His words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Tyler's keyboard clattered in the corner, but even he couldn't drown it out. The silence grew heavy. Grace finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about one warehouse or one raid. It's a system. We've only scraped the surface. Every unanswered question is another trail we have to follow." She tapped the ledger on the desk. "Every code here is a door we can pry open. We don't stop until we know where they all lead." Ellison gave a slow nod, though his eyes lingered on the board. "The network counts on us being blind. We can't let them keep that advantage." Outside, the desert night pressed against the windows, Tucson's faint lights flickering on the horizon. Inside, the team sat with their doubts, their files, and the haunting weight of what they didn't know. As Grace closed the ledger for the night, the young investigator's words still echoed in her head. How many trucks slipped through? It wasn't a question with an answer. It was a warning. and it was the fire that would drive them deeper into the dark. The investigation widened like cracks in dry earth. Weeks after the Sonora raid, the task force's maps were crowded with more black pins than red, threads of yarn stretching across deserts, ports, and border towns. Each morning, Grace McKenna studied the web, her gaze lingering on one cluster that pulsed like a bruised shipments traced not to remote borderlands but to the streets of her own city. Reports filtered in. Unexplained cargo swaps in industrial parks, warehouse leases paid in cash, security vans in uniforms that matched no contract. At first it looked like static, coincidences scattered across normal commerce. But the longer she stared, the more the pattern hardened. This wasn't the chain reaching outward, it was folding back toward them. Ellison dropped a file on the table, his tone edged with fatigue. 3 separate drivers picked up sealed containers this month. On paper, they all checked out legit companies, clean routes. But the manifests? The weights don't match. Somebody's moving ghost freight in plain sight. Grace flipped through the pages, her pulse quickening. Shell companies, dummy accounts, all linked to office addresses in the same downtown district. One in particular stood out, a corporate suite in a glass tower less than a mile from their own headquarters. She pushed the folder toward Ellison, her voice low. This isn't offshore anymore. They're inside the city. Tyler swiveled from his monitors, green code flashing across his lenses. Those communications I've been tracing, most bounce through overseas VPNs. But one signature keeps circling back to a local hub. Whoever's running that account isn't hiding in the desert. He's sitting in a climate-controlled office with a skyline view. The room went still. Grace felt a chill, despite the heaters humming overhead. She remembered Herrera's broken whisper, the weight of the name he had given them, El Consul. Until now, the figure had been a rumor, a voice on encrypted calls, a phantom pulling strings from beyond reach. But the trail on her desk suggested otherwise. The consul wasn't a distant shadow. He could be one elevator ride away. Ellison leaned back, jaw tightening. If that's true, we're not chasing smugglers. We're going up against someone who shakes hands at luncheons, who signs contracts in daylight and runs slaughter at night. Grace closed the file slowly, the decision forming even as fear pressed heavier on her chest. Then that's where we go next. We follow the paper, the signatures, the signals. If El Consul is here, hiding behind the city's lights, then we drag him into the open. For a moment, silence pressed on the room. Tyler adjusted his headset, already running new traces. Ellison rubbed his temples, the weight of politics sinking in. And Grace stood at the window, staring out at Tucson's skyline. Glass towers gleamed against the desert night, their lights glittering like stars. But to her eyes, they weren't beacons. They were masks bright enough to blind anyone from seeing the darkness inside. For the first time, the enemy no longer felt like a rumor from across the border. He was close. Close enough to walk the same streets, pass the same cafes, maybe even brush shoulders in a crowded elevator. The thought tightened Grace's resolve. The consul had built his empire on distance, on the illusion of untouchable shadows. If he was here, within reach, then the mask could be torn away. Grace McKenna sat alone in the task force office long after the others had gone. The hum of the old fluorescent lights above her was the only sound, steady and relentless, like a reminder that the world kept moving even when her thoughts would not. The ledger lay open in front of her, its smudged pages lit by the desk lamp, rows of codes and numbers like scars across paper. Each line represented a life she would never know, a journey that ended in silence. She ran her fingers over the ink, tracing symbols that felt colder than steel. The Sonora raid had been declared a success in every official channel. Politicians smiled for cameras. News anchors spoke of decisive action and an international victory. Yet Grace knew the truth was heavier. The rescued survivors were few compared to the names still missing. The evidence recovered was immense, but the network remained alive, adapting, hiding in plain sight. And now, with hints that El Consul was not an untouchable phantom abroad, but a figure moving freely in her own city, the line between war zone and home had blurred beyond repair. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. The images returned unbidden. The young woman clinging to her sleeve in the warehouse, whispering not to be taken back. The older man's hollow plea for them to stop the killing. The mother at the hangar, clutching a sealed envelope while her baby laughed, innocent and unknowing. These were not just memories, they were promises. Promises Grace had made without words. Promises that weighed heavier than any medal or commendation. Ellison had told her earlier that week, "We may never get them all." He had meant it as a realist, a man who had seen too many wars to believe in complete victories. But Grace wasn't looking for all. She was looking for one. One figure, one architect, the Consul. Because she knew, deep down, if they cut off the head, the rest of the body might stumble long enough to save lives. Outside, Tucson stretched wide beneath the night. From the window, the city looked like a constellation laid across desert sand, glittering towers and neon strips pulsing with energy. But Grace no longer saw beauty in it. She saw camouflage. The very lights that comforted people also gave cover to those who moved shipments, signed contracts, laundered money under legitimate names. Somewhere in that glow, El Consul was hiding, confident that no one would dare search in plain sight. She thought of Alex Torres, his trembling hands wrapped around a cup of water, his eyes hollow with memories he could not escape. He had survived, but he carried the weight of those who hadn't. "They act like it's business," he had said. That phrase haunted Grace. Business, not crime, not chaos. Business, a system neat enough to vanish behind paperwork and polite handshakes. That was what made it so dangerous it didn't look like evil until you stepped inside the cold rooms and saw the truth. Tyler's voice echoed from a conversation earlier that day. Most of their communications are routed through clean channels, servers registered under real companies, contracts filed in real offices. You pull the thread, you hit walls of legality. He had sounded exhausted, almost defeated. Grace had put a hand on his shoulder then, telling him what she told herself each morning. Walls can crack, every system has a fault line. Now, alone in the office, she whispered it again, almost like a prayer. The next morning she walked through downtown Tucson. The sun rose hard and bright over the desert, casting long shadows across glass towers and manicured plazas. Businessmen and women hurried with coffees in hand, phones pressed to ears, lives wrapped in routine. Grace moved among them, her badge hidden, her eyes scanning the buildings. Somewhere here, she thought, was an office that wasn't what it claimed. Somewhere here was the hand that pulled threads stretching across oceans. She stopped at the corner near the tallest tower, its mirrored windows reflecting the morning sky. A bronze plaque at the entrance listed companies, logistics firms, consulting agencies, trade offices. Legitimate, polished, respectable. She felt the weight in her chest tighten. She imagined El Consul in one of those suites, sitting behind a mahogany desk, speaking in the same calm voice Herrera had described, giving orders that sent lives into black bags. The thought chilled her more than any warehouse in Sonora ever had. She turned away, not because she was afraid, but because she knew charging in without proof would only seal the doors tighter. This wasn't a fight with battering rams and flashbangs. It was a war of patience, of paper trails, of listening for the faint signal hidden under layers of noise. That night, back in the office, Ellison found her still at her desk. He dropped a takeout bag beside her, the smell of coffee and stale sandwiches filling the room. "You're going to burn yourself out," he said. Grace didn't look up. "Not until I know." Ellison sat across from her, folding his hands. "I've chased men like this before. They don't break because you charge at them. They break because eventually someone close slips, someone inside grows careless, or someone decides they've had enough. That's how these things end. Not with thunder, but with cracks." Grace finally met his eyes. "Then we wait for the crack." They ate in silence, the office humming with machines, maps still pinned with too many black markers. Weeks turned into months. The investigation grew deeper, tangling through bank accounts, rental agreements, encrypted calls. Each day the city bustled as if nothing stirred beneath its glass and concrete. Each night Grace returned to the office, the ledger always near, the names of those lost heavy in her mind. She knew they might never stand in a courtroom pointing at the Consul. She knew justice in its purest sense might remain out of reach, but she also knew the fight mattered. Every raid delayed a shipment. Every arrest broke a link. Every survivor saved was a reason to keep going. On quiet nights, when the team had gone home, Grace would stand at the window and watch the city lights flicker. She would think of the families in the hangar, the woman rocking a bag to her chest, the infant's laughter cutting through silence. She would remember the older man clutching her hand and whispering, "Stop them," and she would whisper back into the night, "I will." The case was far from closed. The Consul remained a shadow in glass, his network sprawling and ruthless. But Grace had learned something in the desert, among the storm and the silence. Evil didn't always wear masks of violence. Sometimes it wore ties, signed contracts, smiled for cameras. The only way to fight it was to keep pulling until the mask slipped, until enough people saw what lay beneath. The story didn't end with victory. It ended with resolve, a vow carried in the hearts of those who had seen too much to look away. Grace closed the ledger one final time that night. She turned off the lamp, the room falling into darkness, except for the city lights glowing beyond the glass. To anyone else, they were just lights. To her, they were signals, reminders that in every gleaming tower, in every shadowed office, someone might be listening, watching, moving the pieces of a cruel game. And she would be there, waiting for the moment the cracks began to show. Because this was not a story of endings, it was a story of vigilance, of grief carried forward, of promises kept in silence. For every family that walked out of that hangar with only a fragment, for every survivor who whispered in fear, for every truck that had slipped past unseen, Grace carried them all, not as ghosts to haunt her, but as reasons to keep going. The Consul was still out there, the network was still alive, but so was she, and as long as she stood, the fight would never truly be lost. And so, friends, that is where we leave Grace, for now standing at the edge of a battle that is far from over. This story reminds us that evil doesn't always appear in the shadows. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind polished glass and polite smiles. What matters is that there are still people who refuse to look away, people who carry the weight of promises made to the voiceless. Perhaps you, listening tonight, feel that weight too. Perhaps you've known loss, or you've felt the silence of unanswered questions. If so, let this story be a reminder that resilience and vigilance are what keep us moving forward, even in the darkest hours. If this story moved you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections mean more than you know. They remind others that they are not alone in carrying heavy truths. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. That way, you'll always be here with us, walking together through stories that are heavy, yes, but also human stories that matter. Until next time, stay safe, stay watchful, and hold tight to the people you love.